Henderson had been driving 18-wheelers for over 15 years when he encountered something on Interstate 80 that still haunts him to this day. What started as a routine haul from Chicago to Sacramento in the winter of 2019 turned into a psychological nightmare that left him questioning everything he thought he knew about life on the road. It was around 2 a.m. on a Tuesday night when Mike first noticed the car. He was somewhere in the middle of Nebraska, cruising through a stretch of highway that seemed to go on forever under a moonless sky. The snow had been falling steadily for hours, creating a hypnotic curtain in his headlights. That's when he saw it in his mirrors. A dark sedan maintaining the exact same speed, about a quarter mile behind him. At first, Mike didn't think much of it. Plenty of drivers preferred to follow trucks through bad weather, using the semi's taillights as a guide and letting the bigger vehicle break through the worst of the wind and snow. But as the hours passed, something began to feel wrong. The car never got closer, never fell back, never changed lanes to pass. It just stayed there, perfectly positioned, like a shadow attached to his rig. Mike tried speeding up. The speedometer climbed to 70, then 75 miles per hour, faster than he should have been driving in those conditions. The car matched his speed exactly. He slowed down to 55, then 50. The car slowed too, maintaining that same precise distance. When Mike took the next exit to grab coffee and check his logbook, he watched in his mirrors as the car drove past the off-ramp without stopping, disappearing into the snowy darkness ahead. Relief washed over him as he sat in the truck stop diner, warming his hands around a cup of coffee. He convinced himself it had been a coincidence, just another driver heading west who happened to be going the same speed. But when Mike pulled back onto the interstate an hour later, his blood ran cold. There it was again, exactly where it had been before, sitting in his mirrors, like it had never left. The next few hours became a test of Mike's sanity. He tried every trick he knew, sudden lane changes, varying his speed, taking different routes through construction zones. Nothing worked. The car anticipated every move, staying locked in that same position behind him. What made it worse was that Mike could never get a clear look at the driver. The car's headlights created a glare in his mirrors, and whenever he tried to adjust them for a better view, the angle never seemed right. All he could make out was a dark silhouette behind the wheel. As dawn broke over Wyoming, Mike decided to make a test. He took an exit for a small town called Pine Ridge, barely more than a truck stop and a few houses scattered along the highway. He parked at the far end of an empty lot and waited, engine running, watching the entrance. 5 minutes passed, 10, then 15. Just as Mike began to think he'd finally lost his mysterious follower, the dark sedan appeared at the lot entrance. It didn't pull in. It just sat there at the edge of the road, waiting. Mike's hands were shaking as he grabbed his CB radio. "This is Big Mike on I-80. Anybody else seeing this crazy stuff out here?" The radio crackled with static before a voice came through, another trucker heading eastbound. "What kind of crazy stuff you talking about, driver?" Mike tried to explain, but as he spoke, he realized how insane he sounded. A car following him? So what? Trucks got followed all the time. But the eastbound driver's next words made Mike's blood freeze. "You know, that's funny you mention it. I passed a dark sedan about an hour ago, maybe hour and a half. Thing was just sitting on the side of the road, like it was waiting for something. Struck me as odd because there wasn't nothing wrong with it. No hazards, no hood up, driver just sitting there. When I went by, I could swear the guy turned his head to watch me pass." Mike looked out at the sedan still sitting at the lot entrance. The driver was facing his direction, motionless. "What mile marker was that?" Mike asked into the radio. When the other trucker gave him the location, Mike did quick math in his head. If the car had been sitting there an hour and a half ago, and Mike had been driving steady for the last 6 hours. The sedan would have had to travel at over 100 mph to catch up and get ahead of him in a snowstorm without passing him. The realization hit Mike like a physical blow. There wasn't one car following him. There were multiple vehicles, somehow coordinating their movements. Or worse, the same car was somehow getting ahead of him through routes that didn't make sense. His mind raced through possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. Was someone tracking his route? Had he witnessed something he shouldn't have? Was this some kind of elaborate setup? Mike made a decision that probably saved his life. Instead of continuing west, he turned around and drove back toward the truck stop where he'd had coffee. He needed to be around people, needed witnesses, needed to figure out what was happening. As he pulled back onto the interstate heading east, the sedan fell in behind him again, resuming its position like nothing had changed. At the truck stop, Mike parked under the brightest lights he could find and walked inside. He told the night manager about the car, asking if they had security cameras pointed at the lot. They did, but when they reviewed the footage, it showed Mike's truck arriving alone. The sedan was nowhere to be seen on the recording, even though Mike could see it clearly through the window, still sitting in the same spot. That's when Mike noticed something that made his stomach drop. The car's license plate was completely obscured by what looked like mud or snow, but in a pattern that seemed too deliberate to be natural. More disturbing was the realization that in all the hours he'd been watching this vehicle, he'd never seen it signal, never seen brake lights flash when it slowed down, never seen any indication that it was being driven by a normal person following normal traffic rules. The truck stop manager, a grizzled man named Earl, who'd worked nights for 20 years, took one look at Mike's pale face and made a phone call. Within 30 minutes, a Wyoming state trooper arrived. Mike explained the situation, expecting to be dismissed as a paranoid driver who'd been on the road too long. Instead, the trooper listened carefully and then asked a question that chilled Mike to the bone. Has anyone else been asking about your route lately? Any unusual calls or messages? It turned out that over the past 6 months, several truckers had reported similar incidents on I-80, vehicles that followed them for impossible distances, always staying just out of clear sight, always maintaining the same mysterious distance. The state police had been quietly investigating, suspecting it might be connected to cargo theft or drug trafficking. But they'd never been able to catch the vehicles in the act or identify the drivers. The trooper escorted Mike to the state line, where a Colorado officer took over. The sedan followed them both, maintaining its distance even with a police car in the convoy. When they reached the Colorado border, something strange happened. The car suddenly accelerated, passed both vehicles at high speed, and disappeared into the pre-dawn darkness ahead. The state trooper tried to pursue, but lost sight of it within minutes. Mike never saw the sedan again after that night, but the experience changed him forever. He installed a dashcam system with multiple angles, started varying his routes randomly, and began carrying a GPS tracker that his wife could monitor from home. Most disturbing of all, he learned from talking to other drivers that the incidents on I-80 hadn't stopped. They'd just become more subtle, more careful to avoid law enforcement. To this day, Mike doesn't know who was in that car or what they wanted. The official investigation eventually went cold, with no arrests made and no clear motive established. Some truckers theorize it was an elaborate scouting operation for cargo theft. Others believe it was connected to human trafficking networks that use the interstate system. The darkest theories suggest it was something far worse. Predators who hunt the highways, looking for isolated drivers to target. Whatever the truth, Mike Henderson learned something that night that every trucker knows, but rarely talks about. The highways aren't just roads connecting cities. They're hunting grounds where the rules of normal society don't always apply, where predators move in the shadows between truck stops and rest areas, and where a driver's greatest enemy isn't mechanical failure or bad weather. It's the realization that someone, somewhere, is watching every move you make. Mike still drives truck, but he's never forgotten the lesson of that winter night in Nebraska. Sometimes, the most terrifying thing you can encounter on a dark highway isn't what you can see, it's what you can't see, following just close enough to let you know it's there, waiting for the right moment to make its move. Danny Morrison was 3 days into a cross-country haul from Portland to Miami when he pulled into the Hickory Creek Rest Area on I-75 in Georgia. It was 11:30 p.m. on a Thursday, and Danny desperately needed his mandatory 10-hour break. The rest stop looked typical enough: a few picnic tables, vending machines, and a small brick building housing the restrooms. What caught Danny's attention, though, was that he wasn't alone. A blue pickup truck was parked at the far end of the lot, and someone appeared to be sleeping in the driver's seat. Danny thought nothing of it at first. Plenty of people pulled over for a quick nap during long drives. He backed his rig into a spot about 50 yards away, set his alarm for 9:30 a.m., and settled in for the night in his sleeper cab. But around 3 a.m., nature called, and as Danny walked toward the restroom building, he noticed something odd. The person in the pickup truck hadn't moved, not an inch. They were sitting in exactly the same position as before, head tilted back against the headrest, arms hanging at their sides. The sight bothered Danny more than it should have. He'd seen plenty of tired drivers over the years, but something about the complete stillness of this person set off alarm bells in his mind. After using the restroom, Danny walked a bit closer to the pickup, telling himself he was just checking to make sure the driver was okay. That's when he saw something that made his blood run cold. The driver's eyes were wide open, staring straight ahead through the windshield. Not blinking, not moving, just staring into the darkness, with an expression that Danny would later describe as completely blank, like nobody was home. The man appeared to be middle-aged, wearing a plain gray t-shirt, with his hands resting palms up on his thighs. Danny called out, "Hey, you all right over there?" No response. He tried again, louder this time. Nothing. Danny's first instinct was to call 911, thinking the man might have had a heart attack or stroke. But as he pulled out his phone, he noticed the pickup's engine was still running. The dashboard lights were on, and he could hear the soft hum of the motor. Why would someone leave their engine running if they were unconscious, or worse? And why were their eyes open? Instead of calling emergency services immediately, Danny decided to get a closer look. As he approached the driver's side window, the man's head suddenly turned toward him. Not quickly, not naturally, but in a slow mechanical rotation that seemed to take forever. When their eyes met, Danny felt his knees nearly buckle. The man's face was completely expressionless, but his eyes seemed to be looking through Danny rather than at him. There was no recognition, no acknowledgement, just that empty 1,000-yard stare. "Are you okay?" Danny asked through the glass. The man's mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. His lips moved as if he was trying to speak, but Danny couldn't hear anything. The man raised one hand and pressed it against the inside of the window, palm flat against the glass. Danny could see that the man's hand was shaking violently, though the rest of his body remained perfectly still. That's when Danny noticed the smell. Even through the closed windows of the pickup, there was an overwhelming odor of something sweet and chemical, like industrial cleaner, mixed with something organic and rotten. Danny had to step back and cover his nose. He'd smelled plenty of unpleasant things in truck stop restrooms over the years, but this was different. It seemed to stick in his throat and make his eyes water. Danny walked back to his truck and grabbed his CB radio. "Breaker, breaker. Anybody else at the Hickory Creek rest stop on I-75? A voice crackled back immediately. Another trucker parked on the opposite side of the lot. "Yeah, I'm here. You the Peterbilt?" Danny confirmed and asked if the other driver had noticed the pickup truck. There was a long pause before the response came. "What pickup truck?" Danny looked out his windshield. The blue pickup was still there, clear as day under the parking lot lights. The blue pickup at the far end. Guy's been sitting in it for hours. Another pause. "Brother, I don't see any pickup truck. Just you and me out here." Danny's hands started shaking as he grabbed his binoculars and focused on the other truck. He could clearly see the driver in his cab, looking right back at him through his own binoculars. Between them, the blue pickup sat in plain sight. "You're telling me you don't see a blue pickup truck about 30 yards to your left?" Danny asked into the radio. "Negative. Nothing there but empty parking spaces." The other trucker's voice was getting concerned. "You feeling all right, driver? Maybe you need some coffee." Danny hung up the radio and stared at the pickup. The man inside was still pressing his hand against the window, still moving his lips soundlessly. But now Danny could see that the man's other hand was pointing directly at Danny's truck. As Danny watched, the man's finger began tracing something on the fogged glass of his passenger window. Letters, backwards from Danny's perspective, but he could make out what looked like HELP. Against every instinct screaming at him to leave, Danny grabbed a flashlight and walked back toward the pickup. As he got closer, he could see that the man inside was sweating profusely, despite the cool Georgia night. His gray t-shirt was soaked through, and condensation was fogging up all the windows from the inside. The chemical smell was getting stronger, making Danny's head spin and his stomach churn. Danny tapped on the window and pointed toward the door handle, miming for the man to unlock it. The man's eyes widened with what looked like terror, and he shook his head frantically. His mouth opened wider, and Danny could see that he was definitely trying to scream, but no sound was coming out. The man pointed to something Danny couldn't see, somewhere below the dashboard, and then made a cutting motion across his throat. That's when Danny noticed the pickup's license plate. It was from Michigan, but what made his blood freeze was the registration sticker. It had expired 3 years ago. Danny walked around to the front of the vehicle and shined his flashlight on the windshield. The inspection sticker was also years out of date, and there was something else that didn't make sense. The truck looked old, not classic old, but neglected old. The paint was faded, there were rust spots along the wheel wells, and the tires looked like they hadn't been changed in years. But when Danny had first seen it, he could have sworn it looked much newer. Danny decided to call 911, but when he pulled out his phone, he had no signal. That was impossible. He'd used his phone just hours earlier to check in with his dispatcher. He walked toward the restroom building, holding his phone up, trying to find even one bar. Nothing. It was as if the entire rest stop had become a dead zone. When Danny turned back toward the trucks, his heart nearly stopped. The blue pickup was gone, not driving away, just gone, as if it had never been there at all. The parking space was empty, with no tire marks, no oil stains, nothing to indicate a vehicle had ever been there. Danny ran to the spot where the truck had been parked and shined his flashlight on the asphalt. It was bone dry, despite the heavy dew that had settled everywhere else in the lot. Danny spent the rest of the night in his cab with the doors locked, unable to sleep. When other truckers started arriving around dawn, he asked each one if they'd seen a blue pickup truck. None had. When he described the man he'd seen, one of the older drivers gave him a strange look and asked, "You ever hear about the Hickory Creek incident?" It turned out that 3 years earlier, a man named Robert Finch had been found dead in his blue pickup truck at that exact rest stop. According to the police report, Finch had been missing for 2 weeks before a trucker found his body. The cause of death was listed as poisoning from industrial chemicals, though investigators never determined whether it was accidental or intentional. What made the case unusual was that witnesses reported seeing Finch's truck at various rest stops along I-75 for days after his estimated time of death, with people claiming to see him sitting inside, apparently alive. The official explanation was that people were mistaking other vehicles for Finch's truck. Grief and suggestion can play tricks on the mind, but truckers who regularly used that route began reporting similar sightings. Always the same description: a middle-aged man in a gray t-shirt, sitting motionless in a blue pickup, eyes wide open, trying desperately to communicate but unable to make a sound. Danny never drove that route again. He requested transfers to different regions and eventually switched companies to avoid I-75 altogether. But he couldn't escape the memory of that night, especially the look of pure terror in the man's eyes and the way he'd tried so desperately to ask for help that would never come. The Georgia Department of Transportation eventually closed the Hickory Creek Rest Area for renovations that never seemed to finish. The official reason was budget constraints, but truckers in the area whispered about too many strange reports, too many drivers arriving at their destinations shaken and unable to explain what they'd seen. Danny learned something that night that every veteran trucker eventually discovers. The road holds on to certain memories, certain moments of trauma and desperation. And sometimes, when conditions are just right, those memories bleed through into the present, reaching out to anyone unlucky enough to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, begging for help that can never be given. Tom Bradley had been hauling freight across the Midwest for 12 years when he started hearing the voices on Channel 19. It began during a late-night run through eastern Colorado in March 2018, somewhere between Sterling and the Nebraska border. Tom was fighting to stay awake on a stretch of I-76 that seemed to go on forever when his CB radio crackled to life with what sounded like a normal trucker conversation. "Eastbound Kenworth, you got your ears on?" The voice was clear, professional, with the kind of calm tone that experienced drivers used during routine check-ins. Tom glanced at his mirrors, but didn't see any headlights behind him. The highway was empty except for his rig, cutting through the darkness. "Yeah, I copy you, driver. This is the Blue Pete heading toward Denver." The second voice was different, younger, with a slight southern accent. Tom looked ahead but saw no taillights, no other trucks anywhere on the road. He keyed his mic. "This is Big Tom in the red Freightliner. Where you boys at? I don't see anybody else out here." Silence. The radio went dead for several minutes, then crackled back to life with the same two voices, continuing their conversation as if Tom had never spoken. They were discussing weather conditions, road construction, and DOT checkpoints. Typical trucker talk. But something about their conversation felt off. They mentioned construction on I-80 in Iowa that Tom knew had been completed months ago. They talked about a way station in Kansas that had been permanently closed the previous year. Tom tried breaking in again. "Hey, you guys talking about the construction on I-80? That's been done since last fall." Again, no response. The voices continued their outdated conversation, discussing road conditions and detours for construction projects that no longer existed. Over the next hour, Tom began to notice a pattern. The conversation was looping. Every 23 minutes, it would start over with the exact same exchange. "Eastbound Kenworth. You got your ears on?" Then the same responses, the same weather reports, the same outdated road information. Tom timed it carefully, and the loop was precise to the second. When Tom stopped at a truck stop outside Big Springs, Nebraska, he asked the night clerk about CB radio interference in the area. The clerk, a thin man with tired eyes, gave Tom a strange look. "You heard them too, huh?" He leaned across the counter and lowered his voice. "Happens about once a month. Always the same two guys. Always talking about roads that ain't been torn up in years. Been going on for about 2 years now." The clerk explained that several truckers had reported the phenomenon. The voices always appeared on Channel 19 between midnight and 4 a.m., always in the same stretch of highway between Sterling and Big Springs. Local ham radio operators had tried to triangulate the signal, but it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The FCC had investigated, but found no unauthorized transmitters in the area. "Thing is," the clerk continued, "we looked into those construction projects they're always talking about. Found some old DOT records and trucker forums. 2 drivers were discussing those exact same road conditions back in early 2016. Names were Jake Morrison and Eddie Valdez. Both of them died that winter." Tom felt a chill run down his spine. "How'd they die?" "Car accident on I-76, right around mile marker 165. Black ice, middle of the night. Jake was in a blue Peterbilt. Eddie was driving a Kenworth. Head-on collision during that big storm we had in February 2016. Both trucks went off the road and down an embankment. They were talking on their CBs right up until the crash, according to the accident report." Tom looked at his route map. Mile marker 165 was exactly where he'd first heard the voices. Despite the clerk's story, Tom convinced himself it was just a coincidence. Radio signals could do strange things, especially in flat, empty areas like eastern Colorado. Dead truckers talking on CB radios was the kind of story that got passed around truck stops until it grew into legend. But as Tom continued his route east, the voices returned right on schedule at mile marker 165. This time, Tom was ready. He had his phone recording and was taking detailed notes. The conversation started exactly the same way, but as Tom listened more carefully, he began to hear something that made his blood freeze. In the background of the transmission, very faintly, he could hear what sounded like wind howling and metal creaking. Occasionally, there would be a sound like breaking glass or twisting steel. But what terrified Tom most was that he began to hear a third voice, his own. Faintly in the background, he could hear himself saying, "This is Big Tom in the red Freightliner. Where you boys at?" It was his exact words from the previous night, played back as part of the loop. Tom grabbed his mic. "Jake? Eddie? Can you hear me?" The conversation stopped immediately. Dead silence for almost a full minute. Then Jake's voice came back, but different this time. Strained, urgent. "Who's that? Who knows our names?" "This is Tom. I'm driving through your area. Are you guys okay?" Eddie's voice joined in, panicked. "Tom, we can't see the road, Tom. Everything's spinning. The ice. There's black ice everywhere. We're going too fast." Tom's hands were shaking as he keyed the mic again. "Jake, Eddie, listen to me. You need to slow down. There's black ice on the road." "We can't slow down." Jake's voice was getting more frantic. "The brakes aren't working. Eddie, can you see anything? I can't see past my windshield." "Nothing but white," Eddie screamed back. "It's all white. Tom, help us. We're going to crash." Then Tom heard the sound that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The sickening crunch of metal against metal, the explosion of glass, and 2 voices screaming in unison before the radio went silent. Tom pulled over immediately, his heart pounding so hard he thought he might have a heart attack. He sat in his cab for 20 minutes, trying to process what he'd just heard. When he finally keyed his mic again, the normal conversation loop had resumed, as if nothing had happened. Jake and Eddie were back to discussing weather and construction, their voices calm and professional. Tom drove straight through to his destination without stopping, arriving 8 hours early. He called his dispatcher and requested a different route for his return trip. When asked why, Tom couldn't bring himself to explain. How do you tell someone you'd just had a conversation with 2 dead truckers who were still trying to warn other drivers about the black ice that killed them? Over the following months, Tom researched the accident extensively. He found newspaper articles, police reports, and forum posts from other truckers who knew Jake and Eddie. The official report confirmed that both men had been using their CB radios right up until the moment of impact, trying to warn each other about the dangerous road conditions. What Tom discovered next made everything worse. Other truckers had reported similar experiences on that stretch of I-76, but with a disturbing pattern. Several drivers claimed that after hearing the voices and trying to communicate with them, they'd later been involved in accidents themselves. Nothing fatal, but close calls, sudden brake failures, unexpected ice patches, mechanical problems that seemed to come out of nowhere. Tom began to wonder if Jake and Eddie weren't just trapped in some kind of radio loop, but were somehow trying to prevent other drivers from suffering their fate. Or maybe, in their confusion and panic, they were inadvertently causing the very accidents they were trying to prevent. The last time Tom drove through that area was 6 months later, on a different route that skirted the edge of the phenomenon zone. As he passed mile marker 160, his radio crackled to life one final time. But instead of the usual loop, he heard something different. Jake's voice, clear and calm. "Thanks for listening, Tom. We've been trying to warn people for so long. Maybe now we can rest." Tom never heard the voices again, and according to reports from other truckers, the radio transmissions stopped completely around that same time. The stretch of I-76 where Jake Morrison and Eddie Valdez died became just another piece of highway, with no unusual radio activity and no more unexplained accidents. But Tom Bradley never forgot the sound of those 2 voices, desperately trying to save other drivers from their fate, trapped in an endless loop of their final moments, until someone finally heard them and understood. He learned that the highway doesn't just carry trucks and cars. Sometimes it carries voices, reaching across time to deliver warnings that only other truckers can hear and understand. Rick Dawson thought he was getting the easiest job of his trucking career when dispatch called him at 3 a.m. with an emergency run. The load was already prepped and waiting at a warehouse outside Bakersfield, California. Just pick it up and deliver it to a distribution center in Phoenix by noon the next day. Simple enough, except when Rick arrived at the pickup location, something felt immediately wrong. The warehouse sat alone on an industrial road that seemed to lead nowhere, surrounded by empty lots and rusted chain-link fencing. No company signs, no loading dock numbers, just a plain metal building with a single overhead door that was already open. Rick had been driving for 8 years and had picked up loads from hundreds of warehouses, but he'd never seen one this bare bones and isolated. A forklift operator waved Rick over to back up to the dock. The man was wearing coveralls with no company logo and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. When Rick tried to make small talk while the trailer was being loaded, the operator just grunted and avoided eye contact. Rick asked for the bill of lading and manifest, standard paperwork for any legitimate shipment. The operator handed him a clipboard with forms that looked official enough, but something about them seemed off. The company names were generic: Western Distribution and Southwest Logistics. with addresses that were just post office boxes. What bothered Rick most was the load itself. According to the paperwork, he was hauling electronics, televisions, computers, stereo equipment. But as the pallets were loaded into his trailer, Rick noticed they didn't sound right when the forklift set them down. Electronics shipments usually had a certain weight distribution and made specific sounds when moved. These pallets thudded onto his trailer floor with a weight that seemed wrong, too heavy in some places, too light in others. The forklift operator finished loading and immediately disappeared back into the warehouse without securing Rick's trailer or checking the load distribution. Rick had to lock up his own trailer, which was unusual, but not unheard of. As he pulled away from the dock, he caught a glimpse in his mirrors of the warehouse overhead door closing. Within minutes, the entire building was dark, as if no one had ever been there. Rick started his drive toward Phoenix around 4:30 a.m., planning to make the delivery with time to spare. But as he merged onto I-5 and began climbing the Grapevine, his truck started acting strange. The engine was working harder than it should have been, and his fuel gauge was dropping faster than normal. Rick checked his gross weight at the first scale he passed, 78,000 pounds, just under the legal limit. But his truck was behaving like he was hauling 90,000 pounds or more. Around sunrise, Rick decided to pull over at a truck stop to check his load. What he found made his stomach drop. The trailer doors were sealed with a type of security tape he'd never seen before. Thick, metallic strips that looked more like evidence tape than standard shipping seals. More disturbing was that the seal numbers didn't match what was written on his bill of lading. Rick called his dispatcher to report the discrepancy. The dispatcher sounded confused and asked Rick to repeat the pickup location. After a few minutes on hold, the dispatcher came back with news that made Rick's blood run cold. "Rick, we don't have any record of that pickup. The load you're describing isn't in our system, and that warehouse address, it doesn't exist." Rick pulled out his GPS and entered the warehouse address from his paperwork. Location not found. He tried the company names from the bill of lading. Nothing. It was as if the entire pickup had been erased from existence, except for the 78,000 pounds of mystery cargo sitting in his trailer. Rick's next call was to the delivery address in Phoenix. The phone number on the paperwork went to a disconnected line. He looked up Southwest Logistics online and found a website that looked legitimate but felt wrong. Stock photos, generic contact information, and no actual details about what the company did or where they were really located. Panic was setting in. Rick was driving a load with no legitimate paperwork to a company that didn't seem to exist, carrying cargo he couldn't identify. Even worse, he realized he had no way to prove where he'd picked up the load or who had given it to him. The forklift operator had been careful to avoid being seen clearly, and Rick hadn't thought to take photos of the warehouse or loading process. Rick decided to break the seals and inspect his cargo, knowing it would violate every protocol, but feeling like he had no choice. What he found inside the trailer defied explanation. The pallets were wrapped in thick black plastic, but underneath he could see shapes that definitely weren't electronics. Some were too long and narrow, others were oddly curved. When Rick pressed on the plastic wrapping, whatever was underneath felt organic, not metal or plastic, but something that gave slightly under pressure. The smell hit him next. Even through the heavy plastic wrapping, there was an odor that Rick couldn't identify, but that made him immediately nauseous. It wasn't the smell of decay or chemicals, but something else entirely. Something that seemed to trigger a primal fear response that made him want to run. Rick rewrapped the pallets as best he could and sealed his trailer, but he couldn't unsee what he'd found. He called the highway patrol, explaining that he suspected he was carrying illegal cargo. The officer who responded seemed skeptical, but agreed to inspect the load. When they opened the trailer together, Rick's heart nearly stopped. The pallets were gone. The entire trailer was empty except for a few scattered pieces of normal electronic equipment, a couple of old televisions, and some computer monitors that looked like they'd been sitting in storage for years. The officer looked at Rick like he was losing his mind. "This is what you called us about? Some used electronics?" Rick tried to explain about the mysterious pickup, the non-existent companies, the strange weight distribution. But standing in an empty trailer with a skeptical highway patrol officer, Rick realized how insane he sounded. The officer ran Rick's paperwork and found everything in order: legitimate shipping documents for a load of used electronics from a real company to a real destination. The delivery in Phoenix went smoothly. The receiving dock workers knew exactly what load Rick was bringing and had been expecting him. They unloaded the electronic equipment efficiently and had Rick sign delivery confirmation papers. When Rick asked about the strange pickup circumstances, they looked confused. According to their records, the shipment had come from a regular supplier they'd been working with for years. Rick drove home, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong with what had happened. He researched the warehouse address again and found something that made his hands shake. The building did exist, but it had been abandoned for over 3 years. The last company to operate there had been shut down by federal investigators for reasons that were never made public. Even more disturbing, Rick found online forums where other truckers discussed similar experiences. Mysterious loads picked up from warehouses that didn't seem to exist, cargo that changed or disappeared during transport, and deliveries that somehow completed successfully despite impossible circumstances. The truckers who shared these stories all described the same feeling Rick had experienced: the certainty that they had been carrying something they weren't supposed to see, something that operated outside normal logistics networks. Rick never took another emergency load from dispatch. He started researching every shipment carefully, verifying pickup and delivery locations before accepting jobs. But he couldn't escape the growing suspicion that the trucking industry, with its millions of shipments and thousands of miles of highway, was the perfect cover for moving things that weren't supposed to exist in official records. The most unsettling part wasn't what Rick had carried that night, but the realization that it had happened seamlessly. Someone had arranged for him to transport mysterious cargo using fake paperwork to non-existent companies, and somehow it had all worked perfectly. The system had accommodated the impossible, suggesting that Rick's experience wasn't unique. It was part of something much larger and more organized. Rick learned that the highways carry more than legitimate freight. Hidden within the normal flow of commerce, there are shipments that exist in the spaces between official records, carried by drivers who are carefully selected and then made to forget what they've seen. And sometimes, when a driver asks too many questions or looks too closely at what they're hauling, reality itself seems to shift to cover the tracks of whatever shadow network operates just beyond the edge of normal trucking operations. Marcus Webb had driven the route from Dallas to Denver hundreds of times over his 15-year career. But on that foggy October night in 2019, something went terribly wrong. What should have been a straightforward run up I-35 through Oklahoma turned into a nightmare that Marcus still can't fully explain to this day. The trouble started around 11 p.m., somewhere north of Oklahoma City. Marcus had been driving in thick fog for about an hour, visibility down to maybe 50 feet. He was following his GPS religiously, staying in the right lane at a steady 45 miles per hour, when his navigation system suddenly announced recalculating route and directed him to take the next exit. Marcus found this odd. He'd driven this exact route dozens of times and had never needed to exit there before. but GPS systems got updated all the time, and Marcus figured there might be construction or an accident ahead that required a detour. He followed the directions, taking exit 126 onto what appeared to be a state highway heading northwest. The road looked legitimate enough. 2 lanes in each direction, proper lane markings, and standard highway signs. What bothered Marcus was that he couldn't remember ever seeing this exit before, despite having passed this way countless times. For the first 20 minutes, everything seemed normal. The GPS showed him making progress toward Denver, following a route that curved through what appeared to be rural Oklahoma farmland. But as Marcus continued driving, he began to notice inconsistencies that made his stomach tighten with unease. The mile markers were wrong. Marcus had been keeping track of them out of habit, and they didn't follow any logical sequence. He'd see marker 47, then 23, then 61, as if the highway department had installed them randomly. Even more disturbing, some of the markers appeared to be handmade, rough wooden posts with spray-painted numbers that looked nothing like official DOT signage. Marcus tried his CB radio to check in with other drivers, but all he got was static. His cell phone showed no signal, which wasn't unusual in rural areas, but combined with everything else, it added to his growing anxiety. He decided to pull over at the next truck stop or rest area to get his bearings, but despite driving for over an hour on what appeared to be a major highway, he hadn't seen a single service station, restaurant, or even a rest area. That's when Marcus noticed the other vehicles. There were cars and trucks on the road with him, but something about them felt wrong. They all seemed to be older models, nothing newer than maybe 2010, and they maintained perfect spacing, as if they were all following some predetermined pattern. No one was passing anyone else, no one was changing lanes, and Marcus never saw anyone enter or exit the highway. Marcus tried to pass a slow-moving sedan that had been in front of him for miles. As he pulled into the left lane and drew alongside the car, he glanced over at the driver. What he saw made his hands clench the steering wheel so hard, his knuckles went white. The driver was staring straight ahead with an expression of absolute terror, eyes wide, mouth slightly open, gripping the steering wheel like his life depended on it. When the driver noticed Marcus looking, he turned his head slowly and mouthed a single word: "Help." Marcus honked his horn and tried to gesture for the driver to pull over, but the man just shook his head frantically and pointed ahead, as if he couldn't stop. Marcus fell back behind the sedan and noticed that all the other vehicles on the road had similar drivers, people who looked scared, confused, and somehow trapped in their vehicles. The GPS continued to cheerfully announce directions, showing Marcus making steady progress toward Denver. But when he checked the estimated arrival time, it showed he had been driving for over 6 hours, despite his truck's odometer indicating he'd only traveled about 200 miles. Even more impossible, his fuel gauge hadn't moved at all during the entire detour, as if his truck wasn't actually consuming diesel. Marcus decided to ignore the GPS and find a way back to I-35. He took the next exit, hoping to turn around or find a road that would lead him back to familiar territory. But the exit led to a road that simply ended after about a mile, not at a dead end or a construction barrier, but at what appeared to be a cornfield where the asphalt just stopped, as if the road had never been finished. When Marcus turned around and drove back to the highway, he found something that made his blood freeze. The exit he had just taken was gone. There was no off-ramp, no overpass, no indication that an exit had ever existed there. The highway continued in both directions with unbroken guardrails and no breaks in the pavement. Marcus keyed his CB radio again, desperate to make contact with anyone. This time, he got a response, a weak, static-filled voice saying, Breaker 19, this is Lost Leader. Anybody else stuck on the Phantom Highway? Marcus grabbed his mic so fast, he nearly dropped it. Lost Leader, this is Big Marcus. What do you mean Phantom Highway? The voice came back clearer now. You've been driving for hours but getting nowhere? Seeing the same mile markers over and over? Cars that won't stop or change lanes? Marcus confirmed all of these details. Yeah, you're on it too. How long you been stuck? Marcus checked his logbook. According to his records, he'd been driving for 8 hours, but his truck's clock showed it was still 11:47 p.m., less than an hour after he'd first taken the mysterious exit. Lost Leader explained that he'd been trapped on the same highway for what felt like days, maybe weeks. He'd lost track of time completely. Other drivers had reported similar experiences, getting detoured onto a highway that didn't appear on any map, driving for hours or days without reaching any destination, unable to find a way back to normal roads. The thing is, Lost Leader continued, sometimes people get out. Sometimes the road just lets you go, but nobody knows why or how. He described drivers who had suddenly found themselves back on familiar highways with no memory of how they'd escaped, usually discovering that only minutes had passed in the real world, despite feeling like they'd been driving for days. Marcus spent what felt like hours talking to Lost Leader and occasionally other drivers who would briefly come through on the CB. They shared a theory that seemed impossible, but explained their situation. They had somehow become trapped on a road that existed outside normal space and time, a highway that appeared on GPS systems and looked real, but led nowhere, and served no purpose except to collect lost drivers. Then, without warning, Marcus saw something ahead that made his heart leap, the familiar green signs of I-35. His GPS announced, "Merge onto I-35 north toward Kansas City," as if nothing unusual had happened. Marcus merged onto the interstate and immediately saw normal traffic patterns, modern vehicles, and mile markers that made sense. Marcus pulled into the first truck stop he found and checked his logbook. According to all his instruments, he had lost exactly 47 minutes. His fuel level, his driving time, his GPS history, everything indicated a brief detour that had taken less than an hour. But Marcus's watch showed that over 8 hours had passed, and he felt exhausted, as if he'd been driving all night. At the truck stop, Marcus met another driver who took one look at his shaken expression and asked, "You just come off the Phantom Highway?" When Marcus nodded, the driver wasn't surprised. Happens to about one driver a month through this area. Highway department knows about it but can't explain it. GPS systems sometimes pick up roads that don't officially exist, leftover data from planned highways that were never built, or old routes that were abandoned but never removed from the databases. The driver explained that most truckers who experienced the Phantom Highway were told they'd suffered from highway hypnosis, a documented phenomenon where drivers on long, monotonous routes can lose track of time and distance. But too many drivers reported identical details: the wrong mile markers, the trapped drivers in other vehicles, the CB conversations with other lost truckers. Marcus never took that route again without a co-driver, and he always carried backup navigation systems. But he learned something that night that changed how he viewed the highway system. Not every road that appears on your GPS actually leads somewhere real. Some roads exist in the spaces between mapped reality, collecting drivers who make the wrong turn at the wrong time, holding them in a loop of endless driving until some unknown mechanism decides to let them go. The most disturbing part wasn't being lost. It was the realization that somewhere out there, other drivers might still be trapped on that Phantom Highway, driving endlessly through fog and fear, waiting for their turn to be released back into the real world. And Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that next time, If there was a next time, the road might not let him go. Carl Henderson was running dangerously low on fuel when he spotted the truck stop off Highway 50 in Nevada. It was 2:30 a.m. on a Tuesday in August 2020, and Carl had been driving through the desert for hours without seeing a single service station. His fuel gauge was showing less than an eighth of a tank, and his truck's computer was warning him he had maybe 40 miles left before running dry. The truck stop appeared like a mirage in his headlights, a standard pilot travel center with the familiar red and blue sign, well-lit fuel islands, and what looked like a busy parking lot full of other trucks. Carl felt a wave of relief as he pulled off the highway. Running out of fuel in the Nevada desert at night was every trucker's nightmare, and this stop had appeared at exactly the right moment. As Carl maneuvered his rig toward the diesel pumps, he noticed something that seemed slightly off. The truck stop looked modern and well-maintained, but all the other trucks in the lot appeared to be older models, mostly rigs from the 1990s and early 2000s. Carl had been driving for 23 years and could identify truck models by their headlight patterns and body styles, but he didn't see a single truck that looked newer than maybe 2005. Carl pulled up to pump number 7 and climbed down from his cab. The fuel island looked normal enough, standard diesel pumps with the familiar credit card readers and display screens. But when Carl tried to insert his fuel card, the reader showed an error message he'd never seen before. Authorization system offline. See attendant for service. That's when Carl realized he hadn't seen a single person since arriving at the truck stop. The lot was full of trucks, but there were no drivers walking around, no one fueling up, no activity at all. Even the store windows were lit up, but Carl couldn't see anyone inside. The silence was absolute. No engine noise, no air brakes, no conversations or CB chatter that you'd normally hear at a busy truck stop. Carl walked toward the main building, looking for an attendant or cashier. The automatic doors opened normally, and he stepped into what appeared to be a typical truck stop convenience store. The shelves were fully stocked with snacks, drinks, and trucking supplies. The hot food counter had fresh coffee brewing and what looked like recently prepared sandwiches under heat lamps. But there was no one behind the counter, no customers, no sounds of activity from anywhere in the building. "Hello?" Carl called out. His voice echoed strangely in the empty store, as if the building was much larger inside than it appeared from outside. "Anybody here?" No response. Carl walked through the store, checking the restrooms, the driver's lounge, even the shower facilities. Everything was clean and functional, but completely abandoned. Carl tried the cash register, thinking maybe it was a self-service situation. The screen was active and showing a normal point-of-sale interface, but when he tried to process a fuel transaction, it asked for an employee code. Carl went back outside to try the fuel pumps again, hoping the authorization system had come back online. It hadn't. That's when Carl noticed something that made his skin crawl. All the trucks in the parking lot had their engines off, but their parking lights were on. Every single truck was positioned perfectly in its parking space, as if they had all been carefully arranged, rather than randomly parked by individual drivers. Carl walked closer to examine some of the rigs and felt his stomach drop. The trucks were covered in a thin layer of dust, as if they had been sitting there for weeks or months. The license plates were from various states and years, but many of them had registration stickers that were years out of date. When Carl peered through the windows of a blue Kenworth, he could see personal items in the cab. Clothes, a coffee mug, a logbook lying open on the passenger seat. But everything looked old and faded, as if it had been sitting there for a very long time. Carl tried his cell phone to call for help, but he had no signal. He went back into the store and found a landline phone behind the counter. When he picked it up, there was a dial tone, but when he tried to call 911, the call wouldn't go through. He tried calling his dispatcher, his wife, even directory assistants. Nothing worked. The phone would dial, but every call resulted in silence or a busy signal. Carl's fuel situation was getting desperate. His truck's computer now showed less than 20 miles of range remaining. He had to get fuel somewhere, but the pumps wouldn't work without authorization. In desperation, Carl tried to find a way to manually activate the pumps or locate an emergency fuel supply, but everything required electronic authorization that he couldn't access. That's when Carl heard the sound that would haunt him for years, the distant rumble of a diesel engine starting up. He ran outside and saw one of the older trucks, a maroon Peterbilt from the late 1990s, beginning to move. The truck pulled out of its parking space slowly and methodically, its headlights cutting through the desert night. Carl ran toward it, waving his arms and shouting, desperate to flag down the driver. But as the truck passed under the bright lights of the fuel islands, Carl saw something that made him stop running. The cab was empty. No driver, no passenger, just an empty seat behind a steering wheel that was turning by itself. The truck continued out of the lot and back onto Highway 50, disappearing into the darkness as its taillights faded from view. Carl stood frozen in the parking lot, trying to process what he'd just seen. He walked over to where the maroon Peterbilt had been parked and found a rectangular patch of clean asphalt, as if the truck had been sitting there so long that dust had accumulated around it, but not underneath it. But there were no oil stains, no tire marks, no evidence that a truck had actually been parked there at all. Carl decided he had to leave, fuel emergency or not. He'd rather run out of gas on the highway, where someone might find him, than stay at this impossible truck stop any longer. But when he got back to his truck, he found his fuel gauge showing 3/4 full. His truck's computer now estimated over 400 miles of range. Carl checked his fuel receipts and logbooks, but there was no record of him having fueled up anywhere. Carl drove away from the truck stop as quickly as he could, not stopping until he reached Reno 4 hours later. At the first normal truck stop he found, he filled up his tank and asked the cashier about the Pilot Travel Center on Highway 50. The cashier gave him a confused look. There's no pilot station on that stretch of 50. Closest one is about 60 miles north of there. Been closed for renovation for the past 6 months. Carl researched the location extensively over the following weeks. According to satellite imagery and mapping services, there was no truck stop at the coordinates where he'd stopped. The area showed nothing but empty desert. But when Carl talked to other drivers who regularly ran the Nevada routes, several told him similar stories, finding fuel stops that shouldn't exist, filled with trucks that looked abandoned, staffed by no one. One driver, an old-timer named Pete, who'd been running those routes for 30 years, told Carl something that made his blood run cold. "You ain't the first driver to tell me about that place. Thing is, every driver who's been there describes the same trucks in the lot. Same colors, same models, same parking arrangement. Like they're always there, waiting." Pete explained that over the years, several drivers had gone missing on that stretch of Highway 50. Their trucks were eventually found abandoned on the roadside, out of fuel, with no explanation of where the drivers had gone or why they had left their rigs. The missing drivers were never found, but their trucks matched the descriptions of vehicles that other drivers claimed to see at the Phantom truck stop. Carl never drove that route alone again. When his job required him to travel through Nevada, he always made sure to fuel up well in advance and travel with a convoy of other trucks. But he couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere out there in the desert, that truck stop was still operating, collecting trucks and drivers who were running low on fuel and had nowhere else to go. The most terrifying part wasn't what Carl had experienced. It was the realization that the truck stop had somehow refueled his rig without his knowledge or permission. Whatever force operated that place had the power to manipulate physical reality, to provide fuel while collecting something else in return. And Carl couldn't help but wonder if someday, when he was running low on fuel in the middle of nowhere, that truck stop would appear again, and this time he might not be allowed to leave. Steve Kowalski had been hauling freight across the country for 19 years when he encountered something on I-40 through Arizona that still gives him nightmares. It was a scorching July afternoon in 2021, and Steve was pushing hard to make a delivery deadline in Flagstaff. The desert heat was brutal, even with his air conditioning running full blast, and the endless stretch of asphalt seemed to shimmer like water in the distance. Steve first noticed the other truck around 2 p.m., somewhere between Winslow and Flagstaff. It appeared in his passenger side mirror, a red Peterbilt that looked almost identical to his own rig. At first glance, Steve thought it was just another trucker running a similar route, but as the miles passed, something about the truck began to bother him. The red Peterbilt maintained a perfect position alongside Steve's truck, staying just far enough back to remain in his mirror, but never attempting to pass or fall behind. Steve tried speeding up to 70 mph, then slowing down to 60. The other truck matched his speed exactly, maintaining that precise distance like it was connected to Steve's rig by an invisible tether. What made Steve's skin crawl was how similar the trucks were. Both were red Peterbilt 379s from the same model year. Both had identical chrome packages and similar trailer configurations. Even the wear patterns on the other truck's front bumper seemed to match the damage on Steve's own rig from a minor fender bender he'd had 6 months earlier. Steve tried his CB radio to make contact with the other driver. "Red Pete in the right lane. This is Red Pete in the left lane. You got your ears on?" No response. Steve tried again on different channels, but the radio remained silent. He could see the other truck clearly in his mirror, could make out the CB antenna on top of the cab, but couldn't raise the driver on any frequency. As Steve studied the other truck more carefully, he noticed details that made his hands tighten on the steering wheel. The license plate was obscured by road dust, but he could make out what looked like the same state abbreviation as his own plates. The DOT numbers on the cab door were positioned exactly where Steve's were, though he couldn't read them clearly at this distance. Steve decided to test something. He signaled for a lane change and moved to the right lane. The other truck immediately moved to the left lane, maintaining the same relative position. Steve changed back to the left lane, and the other truck mirrored his movement perfectly. It was as if the other driver was anticipating Steve's actions, or somehow knew what he was going to do before he did it. The game of mirror movements continued for over an hour. Every time Steve adjusted his position, changed lanes, or altered his speed, the other truck responded instantly and precisely. Steve began to feel like he was driving alongside his own reflection, except this reflection had taken on a life of its own and was following him across the Arizona desert. Around 4 p.m., Steve pulled into a truck stop in Flagstaff to fuel up and take a mandatory break. As he maneuvered toward the diesel pumps, he watched in his mirrors for the red Peterbilt. The truck followed him into the lot, but didn't stop at the fuel islands. Instead, it parked at the far end of the lot, in a spot where Steve could barely see it, but where the driver would have a clear view of Steve's truck. Steve finished fueling and walked toward the main building, but he kept glancing back at the other truck. From this distance, he could see that someone was sitting in the driver's seat, but the figure was motionless and appeared to be staring directly at Steve. When Steve waved, trying to get the driver's attention, there was no response. The figure just sat there, perfectly still, watching. Inside the truck stop, Steve asked the cashier if she'd seen the red Peterbilt that had followed him in. She looked out the window toward the parking lot and shook her head. "I don't see any red Pete out there except yours." Steve insisted there was another truck at the far end of the lot, but when he pointed it out, the cashier looked confused. "That's just an empty parking space." Steve rushed outside and looked toward where he'd seen the other truck. The parking space was indeed empty, with no tire marks or oil stains to indicate a truck had ever been there. But Steve could have sworn he'd seen it just minutes earlier. He walked the entire lot, checking every parking space, but found no red Peterbilt other than his own. Shaken but trying to rationalize the experience, Steve got back on the road. Maybe he'd been driving too long and was experiencing some form of highway hypnosis or heat-induced hallucination. The desert could play tricks on people's minds, especially during long, monotonous drives in extreme heat. But 20 minutes after leaving the truck stop, the red Peterbilt reappeared in Steve's mirror, in exactly the same position as before. This time, Steve was ready. He had his phone mounted on the dashboard and started recording video of his mirrors. The other truck was clearly visible in the footage, maintaining its eerie parallel course alongside Steve's rig. Steve called his dispatcher on his hands-free phone to report the strange situation. While he was talking, describing the truck that had been following him, his dispatcher interrupted him. "Steve, you're breaking up. It sounds like there's an echo on the line. I'm hearing everything you say twice, like someone else is saying the exact same words a split second after you." Steve stopped talking and listened. His dispatcher was right. There was a faint echo, as if someone else was repeating Steve's words with perfect timing and inflection. Steve looked in his mirror at the red Peterbilt and noticed that the driver appeared to be holding something to his ear, like a phone or CB microphone. Steve ended the call and tried his CB radio again. This time, he heard something that made his blood freeze. His own voice was coming through the radio, repeating everything he'd said during his phone call with dispatch. But the voice was speaking about 30 seconds behind, as if someone had recorded Steve's conversation and was playing it back with a delay. "This is Red Pete on I-40 eastbound," Steve heard his own voice say through the CB. "I've got another truck following me, identical to mine." But Steve hadn't said those words on the CB. He'd said them to his dispatcher on the phone. Somehow, his private phone conversation was being broadcast on the CB radio by someone who had recorded it. Steve grabbed his CB microphone. "Who is this? Why are you repeating my words?" The response came in Steve's own voice. "Who is this? Why are you repeating my words?" The timing was perfect, as if the other driver was listening to Steve's live transmission and immediately repeating it back to him. Steve decided to conduct an experiment. He keyed his mic and said, "My name is Steve Kowalski, and I drive for Wilson Trucking." Immediately, his own voice came back through the CB. "My name is Steve Kowalski, and I drive for Wilson Trucking." But as Steve listened more carefully, he noticed subtle differences. The inflection was slightly off, like someone doing a very good impression of his voice, but not quite getting it perfect. The situation escalated when Steve tried to break the pattern. He said something random. "The elephant flies at midnight." But instead of repeating those words, the voice on the CB said something that made Steve's heart stop. Steve Kowalski is afraid. Steve Kowalski doesn't understand what's happening to him. Steve hadn't said those words out loud, but they were true. He was afraid, and he didn't understand what was happening. Somehow, the voice on the CB was reading his thoughts or emotions and translating them into words. Steve looked in his mirror at the red Peterbilt, and for the first time, he could see the driver clearly. It was himself. The driver of the other truck looked exactly like Steve. Same face, same build, same clothing. But there was something wrong with the expression. The other Steve was smiling, but it was a smile that didn't reach his eyes. It was the kind of smile that suggested the person wearing it knew something terrible that the real Steve didn't. Steve floored the accelerator, pushing his rig to 80 mph in an attempt to outrun the mirror truck. But speed made no difference. The other truck kept pace effortlessly, and the other Steve continued to smile that unsettling smile. The CB radio crackled to life again, and Steve's own voice said, "Steve Kowalski can't run away from himself." Steve took the next exit, hoping to lose the mirror truck in surface streets. But as he navigated the off-ramp, the red Peterbilt followed, maintaining its exact position relative to Steve's truck. They drove through the small Arizona town in perfect synchronization, like a bizarre parade of identical trucks. Steve pulled into a roadside diner and parked directly under a bright streetlight, where he could keep the other truck in clear view. The mirror truck parked in a corresponding spot across the street, and Steve could see the other version of himself sitting in the cab, still wearing that disturbing smile. Steve called 911 from the diner, but when he tried to describe the situation, he realized how insane he sounded. A truck that looked like his own, driven by someone who looked like him, repeating his words and apparently reading his thoughts. The dispatcher suggested Steve might be experiencing heat exhaustion or fatigue and recommended he get some rest. When Steve returned to his truck an hour later, the red Peterbilt was gone. Steve drove the remaining distance to his delivery point without incident, but he couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere out there, his mirror self was still driving the desert highways, waiting for the next opportunity to follow the real Steve Kowalski. Steve never figured out what had happened that day, but he learned something that changed how he approached long-distance driving. Sometimes the most frightening thing you can encounter on the highway isn't a stranger. It's a version of yourself that knows things you don't, smiles when you're afraid, and follows you with the patience of someone who has all the time in the world. Ray Martinez was 3 hours into his overnight run from Memphis to Little Rock when he noticed something wrong with the mile markers on I-40. It was 1:30 a.m. on a cold February night in 2022, and Ray had driven this route dozens of times over his 8-year career. He knew every exit, every rest stop, every landmark along the way. But tonight, the mile markers were counting in the wrong direction. Ray first noticed it around mile marker 157, just west of Forest City, Arkansas. According to his GPS and his memory of the route, he should have been passing mile marker 242, heading toward Little Rock. But the green highway sign clearly showed 155.7, and as Ray continued driving east, the next marker showed 156, then 155. The numbers were counting backward, as if he was driving west instead of east. Ray checked his GPS again. The screen showed him traveling eastbound on I-40, making normal progress toward his destination. His truck's compass confirmed he was heading east. The sun had set behind him hours ago, and he could see the faint glow of dawn beginning to appear ahead of him on the horizon. Everything indicated he was traveling in the correct direction, except for the mile markers. Ray tried his CB radio to see if other drivers had noticed the same problem. Eastbound on I-40, anybody else seeing these backwards mile markers? A voice crackled back immediately. Another trucker who sounded just as confused as Ray felt. "Yeah, I've been watching them for the last hour. Started around mile 160. My GPS says I'm going the right way, but these signs are telling a different story." The other driver, who identified himself as Big Jim, had been driving for over 20 years and had never encountered anything like this. "I thought maybe there was construction or something. Temporary signs put up wrong. But this is going on for too many miles to be a mistake." Ray agreed. Highway departments didn't accidentally install dozens of mile markers backward over a 50-mile stretch. As Ray continued driving, he began to notice other inconsistencies. The exit signs were showing familiar town names, but in the wrong order. He passed signs for towns he knew were behind him, mixed with signs for destinations that should have been ahead of him. It was as if someone had shuffled all the highway signs and put them back in random order. Around 2:15 a.m., Ray reached what should have been mile marker 200, but the sign showed 100. That's when he saw something that made his stomach drop. Coming toward him, in the opposite lanes, was a truck that looked exactly like his own. Same company colors, same trailer configuration, same model Freightliner. As the truck passed, Ray caught a glimpse of the driver and felt his blood freeze. The driver looked like Ray, but older, maybe 10 or 15 years older. The man had Ray's face, but with more gray hair, deeper wrinkles, and an expression of exhaustion that Ray had never seen in his own mirror. The older version of Ray was gripping the steering wheel with white knuckles and staring straight ahead with the kind of desperate focus that comes from driving far too long without rest. Ray grabbed his CB radio. "Big Jim, you still out there? I just saw something that's got me spooked." But when Big Jim responded, his voice sounded different, older, more tired. "Ray, is that you? I've been driving this same stretch for, God, I don't know how long. The mile markers keep going backward, but I never seem to get anywhere." Ray looked at his GPS. According to the screen, he had been driving for 3 hours and had covered 180 miles. But when he checked his odometer, it showed he had only traveled 20 miles since leaving Memphis. The math didn't add up. Ray had been driving at highway speeds for hours, but his truck's instruments indicated he had barely moved. "Big Jim," Ray said into his radio, "how long you been on this stretch of road?" The response came back weak and staticky. "Since last Tuesday, I think. Or maybe it was last month. Time's getting hard to keep track of. The sun comes up, then it goes down, but the mile markers just keep counting backward. I keep driving, but I never reach mile marker 0. Ray felt panic rising in his chest. He looked at his fuel gauge and saw it was showing 3/4 full, exactly what it had shown when he left Memphis. His engine temperature was normal, his oil pressure steady. It was as if his truck was running, but not actually consuming fuel or accumulating wear, as if he was driving in place on some kind of cosmic treadmill. Ray decided to take the next exit, hoping to find a way off this impossible stretch of highway. But when he reached the off-ramp, something terrifying happened. As he drove down the exit ramp, he could see it curving around and merging back onto the same highway he had just left. There was no town, no gas station, no surface streets, just an exit ramp that formed a perfect loop back to I-40. Ray tried the next exit with the same result, and the next. Every exit ramp led in a circle back to the highway, creating an endless loop with no way to leave. Ray realized he was trapped on a section of I-40 that had somehow become disconnected from the normal road system, a stretch of highway that folded back on itself like a Mobius strip. Ray's CB radio crackled to life again, but this time he heard multiple voices, all truckers, all sounding confused and frightened. "This is Diesel Dave. Been driving backward mile markers for 2 weeks now. Night Rider here. Lost track of time. Can't find a way off this road. Smokey Joe, somebody help us. We're stuck in some kind of loop." Ray realized he wasn't the only driver trapped on this backwards highway. There were others, maybe dozens of them, all driving the same stretch of road that counted down instead of up, all unable to find an exit that led to anywhere real. Some of the voices on the radio sounded like they had been driving for days, weeks, or even longer. Ray tried calling his dispatcher on his cell phone, but the call wouldn't go through. His phone showed full signal strength, but every call resulted in a busy signal or dead air. He tried calling 911, his wife, even directory assistance. Nothing worked. The phone would show that calls were connecting, but no one ever answered. As the hours passed, Ray began to understand the horror of his situation. He was driving on a highway that existed outside normal space and time, where mile markers counted backward toward zero, but never reached it, where exits led nowhere, and where time moved differently than in the real world. His truck ran without consuming fuel. His body didn't get tired, despite driving for hours, and the sun rose and set in patterns that didn't match normal time. Ray tried everything he could think of to escape. He attempted to drive backward, thinking maybe he could reverse the effect, but the mile markers still counted down, no matter which direction he traveled. He tried stopping completely, but when he started driving again, he found himself back in the same position as if he had never stopped. The most terrifying part was listening to the other drivers on the CB radio. Ray began to recognize their voices and stories. They were all trapped in the same loop, all driving the same stretch of backward highway, all searching for mile marker zero that would never come. Some of them had been driving so long, they had forgotten their real names, their destinations, even their lives before the highway. Ray heard his own voice on the radio, but it wasn't him speaking. It was the older version of himself he had seen driving the opposite direction. "This is Ray Martinez," the older voice said. "Been driving this road for 15 years now. Still looking for the way home. If anybody new is listening, don't try to fight it. The road has its own rules, and the more you fight them, the longer you'll be here." Ray realized he was looking at his own future, trapped on this impossible highway, aging while driving in circles, becoming one of the voices on the CB radio, warning new drivers about the trap they had fallen into. The backwards mile markers weren't just counting down distance. They were counting down the years of his life that he would spend driving this endless loop. Ray learned that some roads don't just connect destinations. They become destinations themselves, trapping travelers in loops of time and space that exist outside the normal world. And somewhere on I-40, in a stretch of highway that counts backward toward zero, Ray Martinez is still driving, still searching for the exit that will take him home, still warning other drivers about the backwards highway that never ends. Jake Sullivan had been through hundreds of way stations during his 14 years of trucking, but the one on I-84 in eastern Oregon would be his last. It was a foggy November morning in 2020 when Jake pulled his fully loaded rig into what appeared to be a routine DOT inspection station. What he discovered there would change everything he thought he knew about the trucking industry. The way station looked normal enough from the outside: standard concrete platform, electronic scales, and a small building housing the inspection office. But as Jake drove onto the scale, he noticed something odd. The digital display showed his truck's weight, but it also displayed a second number that made no sense: 847 pounds. Jake's truck and trailer weighed 78,000 pounds loaded. So what was the extra 847 pounds measuring? Jake climbed down from his cab and walked toward the inspection office, expecting to find a DOT officer waiting with his paperwork. Instead, he found the building empty, except for a single desk with a computer terminal. The screen was displaying Jake's truck information, but alongside the normal data, license plate, DOT number, cargo manifest, there were additional entries that made Jake's blood run cold. Under a section labeled Secondary Cargo, the computer listed personal memories, 127,000. Emotional attachments, 203. Regrets and guilt, 298 balls. Unfulfilled dreams, 219 balls. Total psychological weight, 847,000. Jake stared at the screen, trying to process what he was seeing. The numbers matched exactly what the scale had shown as his excess weight. Jake heard footsteps behind him and turned to see a man in a DOT uniform entering the office. The officer looked normal enough, but something about his eyes seemed wrong. They were too bright, too knowing, as if he could see things that weren't supposed to be visible. "Mr. Sullivan," the officer said, consulting a clipboard, "we need to discuss your overweight situation." "Overweight?" Jake protested. "My truck weighs exactly 78,000 pounds. I checked it at the shipper." The officer smiled, but it wasn't a friendly expression. "I'm not talking about your cargo, Mr. Sullivan. I'm talking about what you're carrying that isn't listed on your manifest. The weight that doesn't show up on normal scales." The officer led Jake back to his truck and pointed at the scale display. "You're carrying 847 pounds of unregistered psychological cargo. That's a serious violation. You can't operate a commercial vehicle with that kind of emotional overload. It's dangerous to yourself and other drivers." Jake tried to laugh it off, thinking this was some kind of elaborate joke or training exercise. "Come on, officer. You can't weigh emotions. That's not how physics works." But the officer's expression remained serious. "Mr. Sullivan, you've been carrying the weight of your father's death for 12 years. You blame yourself for not being there when he had his heart attack. That guilt weighs 298 pounds. Jake felt his knees go weak. He had never told anyone about his father's death, about how he'd been on the road when it happened, about how he'd missed the funeral because he was stuck in a snowstorm in Montana. "How do you know about that?" he whispered. "You're also carrying 203 pounds of attachment to your ex-wife, Sarah," the officer continued, consulting his clipboard. "You still love her, even though she left you 3 years ago. You keep her picture in your wallet and call her number just to hear her voicemail message. That kind of emotional baggage affects your driving, Mr. Sullivan. Makes you distracted, unsafe." Jake's hands were shaking now. The officer knew things that were impossible to know. Private thoughts and feelings that Jake had never shared with anyone. The 219 pounds of unfulfilled dreams. That's the weight of the farm you wanted to buy in Montana. You've been saving money for 8 years, but you're too afraid to take the risk. That fear is literally weighing you down. The officer walked around Jake's truck, running his hands along the trailer as if he could feel the invisible weight. "And then there's the 127 pounds of memories you're trying to forget. The accident you caused in Denver 5 years ago. Nobody died, but you remember the look on that family's faces when you ran the red light. You carry that with you every day." Jake started backing toward his truck, desperate to get away from this impossible conversation. "This is insane. You can't weigh memories. You can't measure guilt." But as he spoke, Jake felt something he'd never experienced before. A literal heaviness in his chest, as if his emotions were physical objects pressing down on him. The officer held up his hand to stop Jake from leaving. "I'm afraid I can't let you continue with this load, Mr. Sullivan. You're over the legal limit for psychological cargo. You need to unload some of this weight before you can proceed." The officer handed Jake a form that looked like a standard DOT citation, but the violation code was unlike anything Jake had ever seen. "Excess emotional cargo, Class A misdemeanor." "How am I supposed to unload emotions?" Jake asked, his voice cracking with panic. The officer pointed to a small building next to the weigh station that Jake hadn't noticed before. "That's our psychological cargo facility. You can store your emotional weight there. Pick it up on your way back if you want." Most drivers find they don't need it anymore. Jake looked at the building and felt a chill run down his spine. It was windowless, concrete, with a single steel door marked "Authorized Personnel Only." But he could hear sounds coming from inside. Muffled voices, crying, what sounded like people talking to themselves or confessing things they'd never said out loud. "What happens to the people who go in there?" Jake asked. The officer's smile became even more unsettling. "They come out lighter, much lighter. Some of them come out so light they can barely remember who they were before, but they're legal to drive again." Jake realized he was facing an impossible choice. He could enter the psychological cargo facility and somehow unload his emotions, but he might lose parts of himself in the process. Or he could refuse and face consequences that the officer hadn't yet explained, but that Jake suspected would be far worse than any normal DOT violation. Jake decided to make a run for it. He jumped into his truck and started the engine. But when he tried to drive off the scale, his truck wouldn't move. The engine was running, the transmission was in gear, but the wheels were locked in place as if the truck was being held by some invisible force. "The scale won't release you until your weight is legal," the officer called out through Jake's open window. "You can sit there as long as you want, but you're not leaving until you deal with your emotional cargo." Jake sat in his truck for what felt like hours, watching other trucks come and go through the weigh station. Some drivers seemed to pass through normally, but others were directed to the psychological cargo facility. Jake noticed that the drivers who came out of the building looked different. Their eyes were vacant, their expressions blank, as if essential parts of their personalities had been surgically removed. Finally, Jake made his decision. He climbed down from his truck and walked toward the psychological cargo facility. The steel door opened automatically as he approached, revealing a sterile white room with a single chair in the center. There were no windows, no other furniture, just the chair and a small speaker mounted on the wall. "Please be seated," a voice said through the speaker. "The psychological cargo removal process will begin shortly. This may feel uncomfortable at first, but most subjects report a significant sense of relief afterward." Jake sat in the chair and immediately felt something happening to his mind. Memories began to fade. Emotions became distant and muted. The weight in his chest that he'd carried for years began to lift. But along with it, Jake felt essential parts of himself disappearing. His love for his father, his dreams of farming, even his regret over his failed marriage. All of it was being drained away. When Jake emerged from the building 20 minutes later, he felt lighter than he had in years. The officer checked his weight again, and the scale now showed exactly 78,000 pounds. No excess psychological cargo. Jake was cleared to continue his route, but as he drove away from the weigh station, he couldn't remember why he'd been upset or what he'd been carrying that was so heavy. Jake finished his delivery and returned home, but his family noticed something was wrong. He seemed distant, emotionally flat, as if he was going through the motions of life without actually feeling anything. Jake couldn't remember what he'd lost, but he knew something important was missing. Jake never drove through that stretch of I-84 again, but he heard from other truckers about the weigh station that measured more than just cargo. Some drivers sought it out, wanting to get rid of emotional baggage that was weighing them down. Others avoided the area entirely, knowing that some weight is meant to be carried, that the things we feel, even the painful things, are what make us human. Jake learned that the highway doesn't just carry freight, it carries the invisible weight of human experience, the emotional cargo that every driver accumulates over years on the road. And somewhere in eastern Oregon, there's a weigh station that offers to lighten that load, but at a price that might be too high to pay. Years later, Jake would sometimes catch glimpses of his old self in photographs or home videos. He could see the pain in his eyes, the weight he used to carry in his shoulders, the way he held his mouth when he was trying not to cry. But these observations felt clinical, detached, like he was looking at a stranger. The emotions that had once defined him were gone, leaving behind a hollow shell that functioned but didn't truly live. Jake's wife Sarah eventually left him, not because he was cruel or abusive, but because loving someone who couldn't love back was like trying to warm herself by a fire that had been extinguished. "It's like you're not really here anymore," she told him during their last conversation. "You look like Jake, you sound like Jake, but the person I married, the one who used to cry at movies and get excited about sunsets, he's gone." Jake tried to feel sad about the divorce, tried to summon some emotion about losing the most important person in his life, but there was nothing there. He signed the papers with the same emotional flatness he brought to everything else: ordering coffee, paying bills, watching the news. It was all the same level of mild, distant interest. The trucking company noticed changes too. Jake's performance reviews became stellar. He never got angry with difficult customers, never stressed about tight deadlines, never complained about long hours or poor conditions. But his supervisors began to worry about his mechanical responses to situations that should have sparked human reactions. When a fellow driver was killed in an accident, Jake attended the funeral and expressed appropriate condolences, but everyone could tell he felt nothing. Jake started researching the way station, trying to find other drivers who had experienced what he had. He found forum posts and CB conversations about the emotional scale in Eastern Oregon. But the stories were fragmented and often deleted shortly after being posted. Some drivers claimed they had successfully avoided the station after hearing warnings from others. Some said they had been through it multiple times, each visit taking away more pieces of themselves. The most disturbing posts came from drivers who claimed to have refused the psychological cargo removal process. According to their accounts, these drivers had been detained at the way station for hours, days, or even weeks until they agreed to the procedure. Some reported that their trucks had been impounded, their CDLs suspended, their livelihoods threatened until they submitted to having their emotional weight removed. Jake found one forum thread that made his blood run cold, even in his emotionally diminished state. A driver named Pete Morrison had posted about his experience at the way station 3 years earlier. Pete claimed that after refusing the psychological cargo removal, he had been told he could leave, but only if he brought back 3 other drivers who were carrying similar emotional weight. "They gave me a list," Pete had written. Names, routes, even personal details about drivers I'd never met. They knew who was carrying guilt, who was struggling with loss, who was weighed down by regret. They told me I could get my emotions back if I brought them 3 drivers who needed treatment. I thought it was insane, but I was desperate to feel something again. Pete's posts described how he had spent months tracking down the drivers on his list, befriending them, learning their routes, and eventually directing them to the way station in Eastern Oregon. The worst part, Pete had written, is that it worked. After I delivered the 3rd driver, they gave me back some of my emotions. Not all of them. I still can't cry, still can't feel real joy, but enough to remember what I'd lost. The thread ended abruptly with Pete's final post. "I'm writing this as a warning. Don't go to that way station. Don't trust drivers who try to convince you to take that route. And if you see a way station that measures more than just cargo weight, turn around and find another way. Some things are meant to be carried, even if they hurt." Jake tried to contact Pete Morrison through the forum's private messaging system, but the account had been deleted. Jake searched for Pete using every trucking database and professional network he could access, but found no record of a driver by that name. It was as if Pete Morrison had never existed or had been systematically erased from every official record. The realization that Jake might be trapped in a larger system began to penetrate even his emotionally deadened consciousness. If Pete's story was true, then the way station wasn't just removing emotional cargo. It was using that cargo for something, feeding on the pain and regret and love that it extracted from drivers. And it was using drivers like Pete, and potentially like Jake himself, to recruit new sources of emotional energy. Jake started paying closer attention to his interactions with other drivers. Had he been unconsciously steering conversations toward their personal problems? Had he been asking questions about their routes that might direct them toward Eastern Oregon? Jake couldn't remember, and that terrified him more than anything else. If he was being used as a recruiter for the way station, he might be destroying other drivers' lives without even knowing it. Jake decided to make one final trip through Eastern Oregon, not to avoid the way station, but to confront it. He needed to understand what had been done to him and whether there was any way to reverse it. He prepared carefully, documenting his route, leaving detailed notes with friends about his destination, and setting up automated messages to be sent if he didn't check in at specific times. When Jake reached the way station, it looked exactly as he remembered. The concrete platform, the electronic scales, the small building housing the inspection office. But this time, Jake noticed details he had missed before. There were no other way stations visible in either direction on the highway, which was unusual for a major interstate route. The building had no visible power lines or communication equipment, yet all the electronic systems functioned perfectly. Jake pulled onto the scale, and the display immediately showed his truck's weight, plus an additional reading. Emotional capacity, 847 pounds available. Jake stared at the number. It was exactly the same amount of psychological cargo he had been carrying 3 years earlier. The way station was measuring not what he was carrying, but what he was capable of carrying. The emotional void that had been created when his feelings were removed. The DOT officer emerged from the building, and Jake recognized him immediately. The same bright eyes, the same unsettling smile. "Mr. Sullivan," the officer said, consulting his clipboard. "Welcome back. We've been expecting you." The officer's smile widened. "You're here about the recruitment program, I assume. You've done excellent work over the past 3 years. 47 drivers directed to our facility. Very impressive." Jake felt a chill of horror as the officer's words confirmed his worst fears. He had been unknowingly recruiting other drivers, leading them to have their emotional cargo removed, just as his had been. "I want them back," Jake said, his voice flat and emotionless, even as he tried to express desperate urgency. "My emotions, my feelings, I want them back." The officer chuckled. "Mr. Sullivan, you signed a contract. The psychological cargo removal was permanent. However, we can offer you a different arrangement. We have a management position available. Oversee the recruitment program. Help us expand to additional locations. In exchange, we can provide you with supplements. Artificial emotional responses that will make you appear more human to your family and friends." Jake realized he was being offered a devil's bargain. Fake emotions in exchange for helping the way station trap more drivers. He thought about Sarah, about the life he'd lost, about the dozens of drivers he'd apparently already doomed without knowing it. Even with his emotional capacity diminished, Jake understood that some choices were too important to make based on personal benefit. "No," Jake said simply. "I won't help you anymore." The officer's smile faded. "Mr. Sullivan, I'm afraid that's not an option. You've seen too much, know too much about our operations. You can either continue working with us voluntarily, or we'll have to make other arrangements. Jake looked around the way station and noticed for the first time that there were other figures in the building. Drivers who had refused to cooperate, perhaps, or who had tried to expose the operation. They moved mechanically, performing maintenance tasks around the facility, their eyes as vacant as Jake's had become, but somehow even more empty, as if they had been stripped of not just emotions, but free will itself. Jake made his final choice. He climbed back into his truck and drove off the scale without permission, heading west toward the setting sun. Behind him, he could hear alarms sounding and vehicles starting up in pursuit, but Jake didn't look back. He had spent 3 years as an unwilling recruiter for something he didn't understand, had destroyed dozens of lives without knowing it, and had lost everything that made him human. As Jake drove into the desert night, he couldn't feel fear or hope or regret about what might happen next. But somewhere in the hollow space where his emotions used to be, he held on to one small, precious thought. He had finally said no to the way station that weighed more than cargo. And maybe, for the first time in 3 years, that meant something. Bobby Chen had been driving for Midwest Freight Lines for 6 years when he started getting calls from the night shift dispatcher, who didn't exist. It began on a rainy Thursday night in October 2021, somewhere between Kansas City and St. Louis on I-70. Bobby was running behind schedule due to weather delays when his Qualcomm unit beeped with an incoming message at 2:47 a.m. The message was from Dispatcher 7, a designation Bobby had never seen before. All the dispatchers at Midwest Freight used their real names in the system. Sarah, Mike, Janet, and Tom covered the various shifts. There was no Dispatcher 7, and Bobby had never heard of anyone using just a number instead of their name. Driver 421, this is dispatch. Take exit 89 for alternate route. Construction ahead will delay you 3 hours. Acknowledge. Bobby checked his GPS and his trucking atlas. Exit 89 was coming up in about 5 miles, but according to his information, it led to a small farm road that didn't connect to any major highways. There was no alternate route through that exit. Bobby keyed his mic to respond via the Qualcomm. Dispatch, this is Bobby Chen, truck 421. Can you confirm that route? Exit 89 doesn't show any through roads on my map. The response came back immediately. Driver Chen, trust dispatch. Take exit 89. Time is critical. Lives depend on your compliance. The phrase, lives depend on your compliance, sent a chill down Bobby's spine. In 6 years of trucking, he'd never heard a dispatcher use language like that. Bobby tried calling the main dispatch number on his phone, but it went straight to voicemail, unusual for a 24-hour operation that always had someone on duty. Bobby decided to trust his experience over the mysterious message. He stayed on I-70, figuring he'd deal with whatever construction delays lay ahead. But 20 minutes later, his Qualcomm beeped again. Driver 421, you missed your exit. This is your final warning. Turn around immediately and take exit 89. Failure to comply will result in immediate termination and forfeiture of all benefits. Bobby had never been threatened like this by any dispatcher. Company policy was strict but professional. They didn't make threats about termination over routing decisions. Bobby tried the main dispatch number again, and this time someone answered, but the voice wasn't one he recognized. Midwest Freight Lines, night dispatch. This is... The voice trailed off, as if the person had forgotten their own name. How can I help you? The voice sounded strained, exhausted, like someone who had been working far too long without rest. This is Bobby Chen, truck 421. I'm getting strange routing instructions from someone calling themselves Dispatcher 7. Can you verify this route? There was a long pause. Then, Dispatcher 7? I don't know about any Dispatcher 7. I'm the only one here tonight. I've been the only one here for another pause. How long have I been here? Bobby felt his hands tighten on the steering wheel. Who is this? What's your name? But the line had gone dead. Bobby tried calling back multiple times, but now the number wasn't even ringing. It just went to a busy signal. Bobby's Qualcomm beeped again. Driver 421, you are now 47 minutes behind optimal schedule. Other drivers are depending on you to maintain the chain. Turn around now or face the consequences. Bobby stared at the message. What chain? What other drivers? He was hauling automotive parts from Detroit to Phoenix, a routine solo run with no connection to other shipments. Bobby decided to ignore the messages and continue on his planned route. But as he drove through the Missouri countryside, he began to notice other trucks on the highway that seemed to be following similar patterns. Every truck he passed was maintaining exactly 65 mph, staying in the right lane and following precise spacing intervals. It was as if they were all part of some coordinated convoy. Bobby tried his CB radio to talk to the other drivers. Breaker 19, this is Bobby in the blue Freightliner. Anybody else getting weird dispatch messages tonight? One by one, voices responded, all of them sounding confused and frightened. This is Hammer Down, yeah. I got some dispatcher telling me to take routes that don't exist. Road Dog here. Been getting messages from Dispatcher 7 all night. Don't know who that is. Night Rider checking in. My dispatch is acting real strange tonight, like they don't know where they are. Bobby realized he wasn't the only driver experiencing this phenomenon. Every trucker on the highway was getting instructions from the mysterious Dispatcher 7, and none of them could reach their normal dispatch offices. It was as if the entire trucking communication network had been hijacked by someone or something that was giving drivers contradictory and impossible routing instructions. Bobby's Qualcomm beeped with another message, but this one was different. Driver 421, we know you're talking to the others. Stop using CB radio immediately. Return to assigned route. The schedule must be maintained. Bobby hadn't mentioned using his CB radio to anyone. Somehow, Dispatcher 7 was monitoring his communications. Bobby turned off his CB and tried his cell phone again, calling his wife to let her know something strange was happening. But when she answered, her voice sounded different, distant, mechanical. Bobby, where are you supposed to be right now? Dispatcher 7 called here looking for you. They said you're off route and need to report in immediately. Linda, how did some dispatcher get our home phone number? And why are you talking like that? But Linda's voice continued in the same flat, emotionless tone. Bobby, you need to follow your routing instructions. The schedule is very important. Other people are counting on you. Bobby hung up and tried calling his brother, his best friend, even his mom. Every person he called gave him the same message in the same mechanical voice. Follow the routing instructions. Maintain the schedule. Don't deviate from the plan. It was as if everyone he knew had been replaced by robots, programmed to deliver the same message. Bobby pulled into a truck stop, desperate to find help, or at least someone who could explain what was happening. But the truck stop was eerily quiet. There were dozens of trucks in the lot, but no drivers anywhere. The building was lit up, but when Bobby went inside, he found it empty except for a single phone booth in the corner that was ringing continuously. Bobby answered the phone. Driver 421, said the now familiar voice of Dispatcher 7. You have disrupted the schedule. The chain is broken. Other drivers are stranded because of your non-compliance. Bobby could hear background noise through the phone, multiple voices, all sounding panicked and confused. What schedule? What chain? I'm just hauling auto parts, Bobby shouted into the phone. You are part of a larger system, Dispatcher 7 replied. Every driver, every load, every mile is connected. When one driver deviates, the entire network suffers. You must return to your assigned route immediately. Bobby hung up and ran outside, but something had changed. The truck stop parking lot was now full of drivers, but they were all standing perfectly still next to their trucks, staring at Bobby with expressions of desperate pleading. They opened their mouths as if trying to speak, but no sound came out. They pointed at their trucks, then at Bobby, then made gestures as if they were trapped and needed help. Bobby understood with growing horror that these drivers had all refused to follow Dispatcher 7's instructions and were now somehow trapped, unable to leave the truck stop, unable to speak, able only to stand by their trucks and wait for what? Bobby ran back to his truck and started the engine. His Qualcomm immediately beeped with a final message. Driver 421, last chance. Take exit 89 and follow the prescribed route. Join the network willingly or become part of it permanently. Bobby looked back at the trapped drivers in the parking lot, still standing motionless by their trucks. Bobby made his choice. He drove back to exit 89 and took the farm road that his maps said led nowhere. But as he drove deeper into the Missouri countryside, the road began to change. It widened into a proper highway with mile markers and exit signs that weren't on any map. He passed other trucks, all maintaining perfect spacing and speed, all following the same mysterious route that didn't officially exist. Bobby never found out who or what Dispatcher 7 was, but he learned that the trucking industry operates on networks that extend far beyond the official logistics systems. Somewhere in the space between mapped roads and documented routes, there's a shadow network that moves cargo and drivers according to schedules that serve purposes no one understands. And once you become part of that network, following routes that don't exist to destinations that aren't on any map, you might never find your way back to the roads you used to know.